Okay, so in the last class we have started discussing about the sources basically, right, literary sources, and we did discuss about some of the sources. Specifically we did discuss about the Brahmanical sources, right. So as we have already discussed the Brahmanical sources, and basically we were just talking about the Brahmanical sources, the Brahmanas, the Vedas, right, and the Vedas, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. And apart from this, we did discuss about some other, basically the Smriti literature. There we did discuss about this Puranas, right, Smritis, and the Sutra literature, right, and the epics, right. So I think at the end people have been discussing about the, Mahabharata and Ramayana, and to these two epics basically we did discuss. So as I was just telling you about, those kind of things, I mean those literature that we have seen, that if we'll talk about the Mahabharata and Ramayana, so of course these are very valuable source to know about our society, but at the same time we must know about the complications which are there or which are hidden in with these kind of sources, because I just did discuss about Mahabharata and Ramayana, that's a normal perception that Mahabharata was written later and Ramayana was written earlier as compared to Mahabharata, but unfortunately if we'll analyze seriously, in that case we'll find that it seems that Mahabharata is older than Ramayana, and I just gave you some examples also. Do you remember that? What example I just told you, which is proving that Mahabharata is older than Ramayana? Possession of women, I just told you about, right? Fine. What else? Sorry. The Sanskrit is, that won't be a fit example here. What else? Sorry? Worship of Krishna. Worship of Krishna. Okay. There are a few things, right? So I just told you about certain practices, right? And those practices, and apart from the practices, which is again one of the most important things, right? But I didn't discuss that yesterday, because if we'll try to correlate the Ramayana and Mahabharata with the archaeological sources, try to get my point seriously, right? If we'll try to correlate with Ramayana and Mahabharata with the archaeological sources, then again it has been approved, right, or it could be proved that Ramayana was actually Mahabharata was older than Ramayana, because do you remember one day I was just telling you about the movement of people from west to east, right? What was the center of Mahabharata? कुरुक्षेत्र कहाँ है? हरियाणा. And Hastinapur? UP, right? And okay, fine. And Indraprastha? Delhi, right? Okay. So people are much aware. Sorry? You got excited. Are you from Delhi only? No, you're not from Haryana. Okay. So somehow this fellow has experienced, right, Mahabharata, and that is why, might be also. I'm just kidding here. Okay. Somehow, can you relate it to why actually I'm telling you about all this? That's important. Right. Acha, have we received any as such archaeological source for Mahabharata and Ramayana? No? Pakka? Ramayana के लिए है. Sorry? Okay. Look, if we'll talk about the archaeological references, right, in that case definitely we don't find much archaeological references for Ramayana, right? And in fact, when we did the excavations of Ayodhya, there we didn't find anything as such which could be said, on the basis of what it could be said, there was certain archaeological sources which are testifying that Ramayana, this was the center of Ramayana, but somehow, as you do know, that there's a popular imagination for Ramayana that it happened in Ayodhya, right? Whether for Mahabharata, that's a popular imagination that yes, Kurukshetra, Hastinapur and Indraprastha were the centers of Mahabharata, right? So somehow, look, try to get my point. If the center of Mahabharata was if the center of Mahabharata was here and the center of Ramayana was here, so what do you think? What might have taken place earlier, Mahabharata or Ramayana? Mahabharata, right? Because we do know that society is basically moving from, basically it's about the Aryans, right? Or civilization is moving from west towards east, right? So initially after this, basically the Sub-Sindhava land, right, or the Indus land, they migrated to the upper Gangetic plains. So can't you relate it with the migration of people basically in the later Vedic period, right? As it has been said, they have shifted to the upper Gangetic plains. And in fact, when we'll study about later Vedic period, we'll find or we'll come to know about some of the centers of or the archaeological sites for the later Vedic period, such as Ataranji Kheda, right, or Hastinapur. So these are few sites. We do know the references of these sites on the basis of archaeological sources, right, that these were actually habited by the people during the later Vedic period, right? So somehow we can say that that story of Mahabharata it could be related, the story of Mahabharata could be related with the later Vedic period. So if you are moving ahead, right, or if you are moving towards east, it definitely means that must be from Janpad period, right? So because this area which is known as lower Gangetic plains, that was settled by people, right, people started settling in those regions only in the Janpada period, right, or the post later Vedic period, or that is also known as Mahajanpada period. So it is very obvious, yes, it is true that it was taking place after Mahabharata. So there were so many sources, there were so many, or we can say there were so many evidences or facts which are telling us about the incident. Yes, there is a possibility that Ramayana must be taking place late, right? One more thing that I was discussing, that about the sources, right, archaeological sources for the Mahabharata. If we'll talk about Mahabharata, right, then the archaeological source, there are definitely few archaeological sources are there which are testifying or which are proving that there might be certain historicity in Mahabharata, such as when people have started excavating that Purana Kila, right, that is the area which is known as Indraprastha, right? So there they have found actually some of the bricks which might be which might be used by the people in much earlier age, right? And in fact they are trying to relate it with the NVPW sites, right? So somehow they are saying it might be possibility that there was there was some village which continued in that particular region from the earliest time to the Purana to the period of Sirsa Suri, right? And that is what they are saying, there might be a possibility that this area was already habited, right? It was already settled. So that is one of the evidences is talking about the historicity of Mahabharata. Well, apart from this, some other thing also could be discussed, such as like there are some reference. There's a reference, not some references. There is a reference of a flood in Indraprastha area, right? And basically it has been discussed in a Purana, that because of a flood, finally the grandson of Arjun, his name was? What was the name of grandson of Arjun? Kaun? Abhimanyu was son of Arjun and son of Abhimanyu. डरा क्यों रहे यार उसको? I think it was Parikshit, right? I don't remember the exact name, but I think it was Parikshit. So we have a reference for Parikshit in Puranas, right? That just because of a flood, Parikshit had to leave this area and he had to shift towards east, right? Or somewhere in the lower Gangetic plains. And in fact, the archaeological sources of that period, right? Whenever we go for this excavation, so the archaeological sources actually approves that yes, there was a sign of flood somewhere around in 4th century BCE, right? And just because of that reason, we can say there are few archaeological sources which are actually talking about some incidents. But on the basis of that, definitely we cannot claim that this Mahabharata actually took place, right? Because there are some other things which are also very important. Look, as the glorious age has been shown in Mahabharata, you can understand ki, they were just talking about the empire in a way that it was a huge empire. If you read Mahabharata or the different parvas of Mahabharata, you'll find that it has been discussed in such a way that they have just mentioned about the huge empires. But as you can understand, this is the area, right, where you'll find Indraprastha is located, Hastinapur is located, right, Kurukshetra is located. So it was just about a very small area, right, and that is where they have been compared with a tribal community rather than very advanced sort of society, right. So if it is a story or if it is a real story, then in that case there might be a possibility that it was simply a story of a tribal community, right. Now, in that tribal community, you'll find so many other things, such as, because it was all about a tribal community, and as we do know that by the later Vedic period, people have, they got conscious for their, land, and as they have started, practicing agriculture, and because of that, what might be possibility, okay, it was simply a class for the land, right, but it was not that much glorious, which has been normally imagined by the people, and that is why, and there's another thing that that I discussed in the last class also, there might be a story, very, small story regarding, Mahabharata, but later on what happened, people kept on glorifying it. And in fact, if you have studied the NCERT, you might have studied this fact that Mahabharata is a text which people kept on, increasing. Initially only 8,800, slokas were there, and later on it became 24,000, and finally it became 1 lakh, and then only people have started calling it Sat Sahasri Samhita, right, or Mahabharata. So somehow it might be a very, small narrative or story, but later on people have glorified the story, and then it became Mahabharata, and somehow when people started relating themselves with this story, right, or they found some their religious, the religious significance of the text, and then we'll find that these kind of text became popular, but initially these might not be very popular, and in fact when some religious themes have also been added, so then we'll find that it is becoming like that, right. Okay, there's another example that could be put here, right. What is that another example? Normally the Vedas have been compiled or composed in which format? Prose or poetry? No, Vedas are basically in prose, right? Sorry, poetry. Vedas are basically in poetry format. If you'll read Ramayana, you'll find Ramayana in, whether you'll find that initially Ramayana is basically in prose format. And the another thing which is very important, that in Ramayana you'll find that it is more what should I say, it is about more theories, right, it is more about principles, values and some other. Have you seen the Ramayana and Mahabharata? Right, sorry, नहीं, हाँ ये भी बात सही है, ठीक है. The earlier Ramayana and Mahabharata, which was made by B.R. Chopra and who was this? Ramanand Sagar. Have you seen that Ramayana and Mahabharata? Have you ever compared the nature of both the serials? In Ramayana, you'll find long lectures by the characters, right? Whether in Mahabharata, you won't find that much long lectures. Only in few areas, such as Krishna is giving to Arjun, right? And as you do know, it was added later, right? Or the speech which was given by, or the lecture which was given by Bhisma Pitama after this happened, after he was killed in the battlefield, right? So somehow the writing character, the way it has been written, right, that also approves one more thing, that Ramayana was supposed to be the later creation, whether the Mahabharata was supposed to be prior than Ramayana. So there were so many sources which are talking about this particular thing, or that they are justifying that Ramayana might have created later on, Mahabharata earlier. So somehow, as you can understand, but even though I'll just tell you one thing, that if you'll read Ramayana, or if you'll read NCERT also, you'll find, or you'll come to know about different stages, right? So somehow both the epics have gone through so many different stages, right? And that is why we can't say it was creation of a single fellow, right? Or it was a creation of his creation by in a single age. anything is not correct. And in fact, there were so many ages in which these were created. I already told you about multiple stories of Ramayana. That's also one of the realities, right? And in fact, the historians have started analyzing Ramayana in a different way, such as Ramayana and Mahabharata both in a different way. Now, in what way they are analyzing it? So they are simply saying, let us take the story of Ramayana. So Ramayana is a basically story of Ram, Ravan, and there is a third, no, Sita nahi hai. Hanuman, right? So basically it's about Ram, Ravan and Hanuman, right? These are three important, characters basically, right? So basically, as per the historian, these three characters actually shows the development of society, right? How does it, how does it show the development of society? So they are simply saying, okay, look, Rama represent Aryans, right? Ravan represent the Dravidians, right? And the Hanuman, right? The Hanuman represent basically very good, tribals, right? If we'll read Rig Veda or rest of the Vedas, you'll find three terms, right? Arya, Das and Dasyu, right? So they are saying ki Arya, definitely you do understand, right? Dasas were basically the local habitants, right? Whether the Dasyus were basically the tribal people, right? So basically it's a clash between the between the Aryas and the local habitants, right? And here this Dasyus or the tribal people started supporting Aryans, right? So they are simply saying it's a clash between the local communities or the local natives, against this. The local natives are fighting against the Aryans, right? And in this process, basically, the tribal communities were supporting Rama or the efforts of efforts of Aryans, right? And in this process, ultimately, what is happening? The Dasyus were somehow adopted within this Aryan community, and that is where it is expanding, right? So somehow they have compared the story of Ramayana with this also, right? There's another thing which is very important, that so far in Ayodhya, we haven't received so far any as such archaeological evidence of Ramayana, and that is why it is very tough to fix the age for Ramayana, that in what was the real age for the Ramayana. But seeing the land, as we do know that it was the situation, I mean that land was habited or that land was settled only, or that particular zone was settled only during this later Vedic, in the post later Vedic period or Mahajanpada period. So that might be a story of a Mahajanpada period, right? So somehow there were so many multiple interpretations which are there. Okay, fine, I didn't tell you about Mahabharata. So if it is about Mahabharata, so in Mahabharata what happened basically? In Mahabharata basically they are saying that this was nothing but the clash between two Aryan communities just for the sake of land, right? Because once we are moving from the early Vedic period, to the later Vedic period, right? In that case, you'll find that in later Vedic period, land is becoming gradually important. Why? Because in the early Vedic period, they were basically pastoralists, right? Whether in later Vedic period, they became, right? In later Vedic period, they became agriculturists, right? So they are saying that now land is gradually become important to them, and that's the reason that they started fighting against this. There's a sort of clash within the community could be seen, and that's the reason that the cousins started fighting among each other, and that's the reason that we are saying the Mahabharata might be a clash within the Aryan community just for the sake of land. So these kind of interpretations are there. So that's all about this Ramayana and Mahabharata, right? We'll briefly discuss about some other things. I'll just, I'll dictate you something. Okay, so once we are done with this, Brahmanical religious text, right? Then there were some other religious texts also very important. And there we must count about the Buddhist literature, right? Buddhist literature have been actually divided into two parts. canonical and non-canonical, right? In canonical literature, we will find Sutta Pitka, Abhidhamma Pitka. 1, 2, 3. Have you got any idea regarding these three Pitkas? Sorry? About the rules. Rules of? New monks. Okay. First two Pitkas, Sutta Pitka and Vinay Pitka, these were basically composed in the second Buddhist Council. The first two were composed in second Buddhist Council, and the third one was composed in third Buddhist Council. Do you know about Buddhist councils? How many of you are aware of Buddhist councils? Only 2-3 people, 4 people. Why? आपने बुद्धिस्ट काउंसिल भी नहीं सुना है? Last Buddhist council. That's the only thing. What was the point? What was the purpose of holding the Buddhist councils?
To compile his teachings.
That's the only concern. That was the only reason. There were 4 Buddhist councils, sir. Okay, gradually we'll learn about all this, right? But I just thought he might have gone through the NCERT, and that is why he must be learning. Basically, Buddhist council was very simple. Objective was there for the Buddhist council. They wanted to sort out the disputes within the Buddhism, and that's the reason they were having this, Buddhist council. They were holding this Buddhist councils. But while sorting out these kind of things or these disputes within the Buddhism, definitely they found the best way to sort out such kind of things was the compilation of the literature. Because anytime once you have a written regulations or rules and regulations, so that can help you in sorting out such kind of disputes, and that's the reason that they started compiling this literature, right? So what this literature was all about, right? So Sutta Pitka is basically the sayings of Buddha, right? Or the preachers of Buddha is known as Sutta Pitka. The preachers of, right? Then the next is Vinay Pitka, is about rules and regulation for monasteries. Rules and regulation for monasteries. And Abhidhamma Pitka is about philosophical interpretation of Buddhism. Philosophical interpretation of Buddhism. And these all were basically compiled in which language? Pali. Pali, right? Now, as these all literatures were compiled in Pali, but if you think that this particular tradition continued, right, and people kept on compiling the literature in Pali, so that's a confusion actually. And later on, Buddhism, left, or Buddhism stopped using Pali as a prime language, right? And in fact, they also started using some other languages, right? And here onwards, you'll find some non-canonical literatures were also compiled, right? And in the non-canonical literature, you'll find the most important was definitely Jatkas. What are these Jatkas? The pre-birth stories. Pre-birth stories. The Jatka literature was about pre-birth stories, right? But apart from this literature, there were some other literatures also these are also very important in Buddhism, such as, if we'll talk about, these are some literatures which could be divided directly into, canonical and non-canonical. But apart from that, later on we'll find some other texts which were also compiled, and there we'll find one of the most important books, right, for Buddhism was Milind Pano, right. That was actually a basically conversation between Milind, he was a Sakarulus, right, and Nagasen, a Buddhist monk. And that book is basically dealing, it's basically, as I told you, it's a conversation, right, and it's dealing with the philosophies of Buddhism. So that's, it is supposed to be very important. Apart from this, Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa, right? These are the texts compiled in Sri Lanka around 5th century CE. These texts got compiled in 5th century CE. Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa. Have you got any idea about Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa? Have you ever heard about these texts? कभी नहीं सुना Deepvamsa Mahavamsa? You guys must have heard about Deepvamsa Mahavamsa, right? And these texts were compiled in? You don't know. These texts are basically Sri Lankan texts, right? And mind you, for Asoka, these are very reliable sources, right? Because as Asoka spread this, Theravada of Buddhism, and that is where these texts are giving numerous references of Asoka. And in that regard, these are very important, right? Apart from that, we'll find some other things such as Buddha Charit by Ashwaghosh, Ghosh, sorry. Buddha Charit by Ashwaghosh, Lalit Vistar, right? These are some other texts which are important. Initially, Buddhism was using Pali or Prakrit to compile its, literature. But later on, specifically after the Mahayana form of Buddhism, Buddhism also started using Sanskrit or hybrid of Sanskrit and Prakrit, right? So after Mahayana form of Buddhism, and in fact Mahayana form of Buddhism was marking many changes, and because of those changes, what is now happening, that Buddhism actually changed its shape, right, or changed its attitude, and that is why we find that Buddhism is becoming more orthodox, and that's the reason that Buddhism has started adopting the languages like Sanskrit or the hybrid, such a hybrid of Prakrit and Sanskrit. And in fact, just by doing that, they just wanted to complicate the religion, that the common people could not access to the religion, and that is why they complicated it, right? And that's the reason you'll find that Mahayana, after the Mahayana form of Buddhism, you'll find that Buddhism got outrightly changed, right? They started this idol worship, they started considering Buddha as a god. For them now Buddha has become God, and that's the reason that they have started doing this idol worship. And as I hope you remember, that Buddha never allowed for this idol worship, and for Buddha it was always the middle path which must be followed by the people just to get the nirvana, right? But somehow the Buddhist principles got outrightly changed, and this very frequently happens in India, right? Everything which comes to India, it got changed, right? So somehow Buddhism came up as a very revolutionary kind of thing, but they changed the Buddhism itself, right? And in fact, people are always looking for the easier path. So at one particular moment, Buddhism itself was the easiest path to follow the religion. Isn't like that? Because Buddhism, Brahmanism was talking about much orthodox system, rituals, sacrifices and some other things, right? And somehow it was not possible for the common people to follow such kind of practices. And Buddhism emerged as a revolutionary movement, and Buddhism actually liberated people. But at a point of time, this Ashtangic mark or the middle part itself became problematic for the people. Because in that Ashtangic path, right, or I hope you do know the Kali Yuga. Because in Kali Yuga, basically the basically the values of the society is getting down. So now people even could not follow that simple paths, right, which has been prescribed by Mahatma Buddha, and that is why now they started looking for more easy way to follow the religion, and now it was presented by Mahayana form of Buddhism, and that's the reason that Mahayana Buddhism became the most popular form of Buddhism, and the earliest forms of Buddhism such as Theravada and Hinayana, they were completely lost, and in fact in most of the part of the world you'll find it is only the Mahayana form of Buddhism, right, and then some other versions of Mahayana form of Buddhism, right, were being followed, but nobody is following Hinayana form of Buddhism except two territories or the lands or the countries, Sri Lanka, right, and the other was Myanmar, right. So Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and some in some Southeast Asian countries, you'll find that people are still following this Hinayana form of Buddhism. But apart from this, we won't find that Hinayana Buddhism is being followed, and in most of the places you'll find the Mahayana, Vajrayana, and some other form of Buddhism, right. So that's the sort of story also of but somehow this literature is very important. Well, when we are trying to talk about this, Buddhist, okay, fine, let us first discuss Jaina, then we'll talk about this, Buddhist. Now, if Jaina literature is there, right, we are not supposed to discuss that much for Jaina literature. Normally, we'll find so many categorization of Jaina literatures also, right. So, if we'll talk about the Jain literature, right, so in Jaina literature, we'll find the Anga, Upanga, Agam, Sutra, So these are some categories of literature that we find in Jainism, right. More or less the nature of the literature in Jainism is similar to Buddhism, right, only there is a difference of language, right, language, that is Ardha-Magadhi. So they use Ardha-Magadhi for writing their scriptures, right, for writing their scriptures. And as I am telling you that they also had varieties of literature, and these literatures were finally compiled in 5th century CE, and that it was compiled in Balbhi. There was a place in Gujarat. Sorry? Yeah. In Balbhi, Gujarat, right. So these are the literatures, and apart from that we'll find some other literatures also in Jainism, right. Well, if we'll talk about the Jaina and Buddhist literature, in that case you'll find one thing, these are more close to history as compared to the Brahmanical literature. Why? The Brahmanical literature had numbers of problems, right, and in fact at the end we'll discuss about the problems which were there, and in fact the problems such as basically that Brahmanical literature, the prime concern of the Brahmanical literature was always the religion, right, and in fact most of the time they were talking about the spiritual world, right. So the concept of salvation, because the Brahmanical literature is not ending here. Apart from this, we do find about some many other varieties of literature, and every time we'll find that these people were more focused on religion, supernatural concepts of within the religion, right, and in fact they just use the scriptures just to sort of attract people towards this form of towards Brahmanism, that they could make some more money, and that's the concern of Brahmanical literature. So somehow, even though Brahmins were part of society, they were just writing the scriptures with a different perspective. But as I told you that if we'll talk about Buddhism and Jainism, in that case you can we can talk about one thing, that the Jaina people and the Buddhist people were somehow more closer to materialism, right? And in fact, there's a topic which we will do in future, that Buddhism and Jainism were actually more social movement rather than religious movement, right? In fact, their prime concern for Buddhism and Jainism was society rather than religion. They did not want to make a religion through which they could make some money, right? Because this system was not there. And in fact, I hope you must be knowing about the fact that the monks were allowed only to accept that much which could feed them, right? They could not accept more than that. That's a different thing. That's a different, phenomena that, what is happening over the time that, the Buddhist monks and Buddhist and Jaina monks have started accepting more. And that's the reason that the monasteries basically became the power centers, and in fact these became very prosperous, because initially they were not following as per the they were not going as per the Buddha's suggestions, and in fact they have started getting donations and some other things, and finally at the end you'll find that the monasteries have become very rich, right? The first thing, and the monasteries basically became the became the center for the corrupt practices, right? And sometimes you'll find that the monasteries got involved even in trade and commerce. Look, the trade, basically the monks already have, the monks were already having some good relationship with the traders, right? Because mostly they used to travel with the traders, with the traders only, and that is why they always had good relationship. And apart from that, definitely the traders always had some positive benefits from the monks, and that is why they always supported this the monks. But over the time, what happened? As there was a sort of mutual understanding between the traders and the monks, and that is where the traders started giving them huge donations. And that's the reason over the time you'll find they started accepting donations, land and some other thing. They became the center for the property, right? They were owning huge amount of property, and just because of that, so many corrupt practices started coming into into the monasteries basically. So what is happening? One thing that is true, that Buddhism and Jainism, it was more closer to materialism, and in fact they just wanted to hold the second urbanization. We'll discuss these kind of things later on, then understand in a better way. But somehow you just remember this thing, and that is why what is happening. They have mentioned more about the contemporary societies or the existing societies, and that is why we'll find so many practices, so many such kind of systems and the practices which were prevalent in society during that particular period. And these practices were not always religious, right? They were less writing about Brahmanism, they were less criticizing Brahmanism. They were writing more on society, social systems, right? The systems in the state system, the economic systems, right? The systems of Srenis and the guilds. So all such informations could be very frequently seen in the Buddhist writing, and that is why we can say that at least the Buddhist writings or the Jaina writings were better source of history as compared to the Brahmanical literature and all, right? So somehow we can say that these are better sources as compared to the Brahmanical literature, right? Okay. So these were basically Buddhist and Jaina literature, right? Now there is another category of literature which is known as secular literature, right? So as far as secular literature is there, so as I divided the secular literature into two parts, and basically in the secular literature, this could be divided into Indian secular literature and the foreigners or secular literature. So as far as this Indian secular literature is there, so basically in Indian secular literature you will find so many texts which were compiled, right? And these could be put in the secular literature, right? Although in the last class only I just told you that it is very tough to divide, right, the literature into category of religious and secular, because there was no text which was there was no as such text which was not talking at all about religion. In every text which were compiled during this ancient India or composed during this ancient India, definitely talking about religion, because religion was supposed to be the most important goal, right? And of course I hope you must be knowing about those terms. Like initially it has been said that there were normally three goals in him, in everybody's life, and these are four goals, right? Arth, Kam, and Moksha, right? So initially the dharma was supposed to be the most important goal, right? Then Moksha was the next important goal. Gradually, these two also became the important goal, and definitely some other literatures. People have started, compiling some other literatures around these two goals. Getting my point or not, right? Initially, dharma and moksha, right, were the most important goals. Gradually, these two goals have been included, right? And then people have started compiling certain literatures around these two goals, and that's the reason that you'll find the books such as Arthashastra. And as you do understand, Arthashastra was a book which was guiding us to attain this objective or this goal known as Artha, right? Kam Sutra, right? And as you do know, that was to achieve the third important goal, right? So somehow these literatures were also compiled around these kind of objectives or the goals, and that is we'll find some secular literature. But at the same time, I must say you one thing: as you can find the base of these secular literature also in some religious concept, right? I hope you might be thinking of there's this particular concept that the people in that two period, I mean 1st century BC, right? If somebody is writing Kam Sutra, right, it means that there might be a very solid concept, and then only they were writing, because the Indian society hasn't still accepted or adopted this culture, right? Where you can talk about this particular goal, right, openly, right? Still that there was a sort of different notion or different sort of attitude we people are having. But even though if somebody is writing, like Vatsayana is writing Kam Sutra in that particular period, so definitely some religious backup was there, and that's the reason that in most of the temples which were developed during early medieval period, you'll find that the themes have been picked up from there, right? And that is why it was having certain religious concepts. That is why this book was written, right? And sometimes it has been said if you have attained all these three, it could help you attaining moksha, right? So somehow these books were also related to the religion. So you can't say that these books were prevailing independently. It had nothing to do with religion. That cannot be said, right? So somehow these are also related to religion, and that is why it is slightly tough. And at the vice versa is also true, because if we talk about the secular literature such as Arthashastra and the religious literatures, so it doesn't mean that the religious literature did not have any as such mention of the society. Of course they did mention about the society. So you can't say if it is about religion, so they are very simply they are just telling us about the religion only, right? Definitely the society or the existing or the contemporary society was definitely also one of the prime concern for them, and they were writing a lot about the existing society, and that is why it is tough. But even though we do this, right, and that is why we are talking about some some secular literature, right? So as far as the secular literatures are there, so definitely some literature, as I told you, developed around these two goals, right? And as you understand that Arthashastra, right, then Kam Sutra, right, book closer to Arthashastra, developed in 6th and 7th century, called as Nitisa, written by Kamanda, right? Some other such as Natyasastra, Silf Shastra, right? So okay, these some were developed around these two goals, right? But apart from this, we'll find certain other kind of text that could be called as such as hagiography. Do you understand hagiography? Hagiography, the biography of the monks and saints, known as hagiography, right? Biography, the biography of rulers specifically, such as Harshcharit, Ramcharit, Musik Vamsa. These are certain biographies. Okay, apart from that, some such texts were developed or some such, literature was developed which were around any particular ruler or dynasty, such as, I hope you remember the book Musik Vamsa. Mudra Rakshas, right? It was written by Visakadatta, right? Apart from Mudra Rakshas, there was another text written by Visakadatta who was Devi Chandragupta. Devi Chandragupta, right? Mudra Rakshas is the only book which is telling us about Chandragupta Maurya and Chanakya. I hope you might have seen or watched many serials on Chandragupta Maurya. So you do know that Chandragupta Maurya was a fellow from some parts of UP, and then he was taken to Takshashila by Chanakya, and then he was trained, and finally Chanakya had to take certain revenge with Dhananand, right? And that is why he trained that fellow Chandragupta. Finally he got prepared, he attacked on Dhananand. Dhananand got defeated, right? And Chandragupta became the ruler, and finally the Mauryan Empire established, right? And I think you remember one day I was just telling you about Vincent Arthur Smith, right? You remember that, right? And while writing the book, The Early History of India, I just told you one thing. In 1/3 of his book, it has been mentioned Alexander, right? I mean, Alexander has been given priority. And in fact, there was no source in India which was talking about Alexander and simultaneously this fellow also, Chandragupta Maurya, right? No source. In fact, I hope you remember those sources which talked about Chandrakotas, Andrakotas and some other, right? So basically, from the foreign sources, we came to know about Chandragupta Maurya. So the only source which is talking about, the Indian source which is talking about Chandragupta Maurya, that is Mudra Rakshas, right? So I hope, and that book was written very late, 7th century AD, 7th century CE, right? So that book was written on 7th century CE, right? That was the age of the book. Same is true for this book. There was a Gupta ruler called Ram Gupta, right? And this book is basically dealing with his marriage or his affair with Devi. She was a lady, right? And so basically it's about that a relationship of these two Ram Gupta and that lady Devi, right? So this is the source which is talking about that, right? So somehow these are some other texts which are which are also talking about some historical concepts or the facts, and of course these are very valuable source to know about history, right? Well, apart from this, definitely we can talk about some other authors during this ancient Indian period, such as Bhas, right, Sudrak, Kalidas, and these have also written the books, and sometimes in their novels the characters have been picked up from history only, right? So as you do know that Abhigyan Sakuntalam or the books which were written by Kalidas, sometimes centered, right, or sometimes basically the narratives have been developed around a historical character, right? So definitely if anything which has been developed around the historical character, so definitely certain sense of history or certain historical information could be seen in those kind of writings. So definitely these are becoming very important. Well, unfortunately we must remember one more thing, that while using those sources as a source of history, you must remember one thing, that what was the basic objective of writing that year, right? As somebody is making a movie on Akbar, or somebody is making a movie on any other figure, right, historical figure, so the prime objective of the person is to make some money, right? When Asutosh Govatrikar was making Mohenjo-daro, so the prime concern of that fellow was to make some money. So it was a commercial movie, and that is why in commercial places you can't expect history. So if somebody is trying to learn from those commercial things, so that's the sort of mistake that he or she is committing. So somehow while reading these books, unfortunately this happened to Govatrikar, that he somehow could not understand that he's making a movie, commercial movie or a documentary, right? So that movie was, I think, actually he tried to recreate this Mohenjo-daro, and somehow he could not appeal to the people, because he just thought of creating 300 or making 300. I hope you all have watched 300, right? So there were so many period films which were made in Hollywood, and these period films are very successful also, and somehow people always love to watch these kind of period films. But unfortunately, Asutosh Govatrikar was trying his hand in India, right? इंडिया में इतने पुरानी चीज़ें देखें, जब तक जीन्स में हीरो नहीं होता तब तक धोती में किसको मजा आता है? हीरो हमेशा फटी हुई जीन्स में होना चाहिए, तभी हीरो है वो. सॉरी, खिलजी के साथ ये लागू नहीं होता. हाँ, खिलजी के साथ लागू इसलिए नहीं होता है क्योंकि दैट मूवी वाज समहाउ कुड अपील द पीपल बिकॉज ऑफ दैट कंट्रोवर्सी, राइट? That controversy, right? So yes, there was some certain historical figures are definitely there, and in fact you must know one thing: those who are very popular, those characters, such as it is not Khilji which made the film popular; it is the Padmavati which made the film popular, right? That Maratha fellow, what was his name? Baji Rao, right? So it is not the lady who made the film popular; it was the character of that Maratha character who made the film popular. Although it was based only on this, because I think Baji Rao is not known for Mastani, Baji Rao is known for so many other things, but somehow all those other things have been sidelined and they have just shown us this, his affair with Mastani and all. But anyways, I mean, those who are not having the taste of history, they won't be able to understand these kind of things, right? Anyways, take care. So what I was telling you, that while reading this text, you have to be very clear that their prime purpose was something else. They just, they were just trying to create a fictional novel, right? It is a different thing that it was, moving around a historical character, right? But somehow, while, using that as a source of history, you must remember all such kind of things. So that is a sort of, suggestion to the historians that would be given, right? So, okay, we have a huge compilation of Indian literature. Now the question arises here, in what way these sources could be used as these, literary materials could be used as a source of history, right? So, what do you think? These are the positive. What we first discussed, the positive sides or the negative sides? For the literary sources, negative sides, because the negative sides are more important, right? So let us begin the discussion with the negative sides, right? Now, if we'll talk about the negative sides, right? So what are the most complicated problem with this, literature?
Written by more people and add so many appendixes.
Written by more number of people. Very good. Okay, fine. It's all about compilation. Okay, fine. Anything else? Biased. True. Or kuch? Maybe. State sponsored. Maybe. True. Okay. I'm just trying to put all those points into a hierarchy, right? And that particular thing is not there in the notes, so you'll keep on writing, right? So you just write, give the heading, the problems using the literary sources or the literary materials as a source of history. Right? Now, problems in the literary sources, right? One thing that I told you, क्या हो गया? That whenever you talk about history, the sense of time is very important, right? without the sense of time you cannot write history, because history must be written in a chronological order, and if you don't have the proper concept, proper understanding of the timing for anything, you won't be able to write a historical text, right? So you just remember that thing. The first problem with this text is time itself, or we can say age, right? Just write a sentence and then I'll discuss it further. The biggest problem, or you just write in a way, one of the biggest problem with literary sources is to fix the right age, of the text. As we do know that the ancient religious text were composed in many different stages, such as Vedas, epics, Puranas, etc. Without knowing the exact time period for any particular text, it is very tough to decide that for what society they are talking about. I think this point is clear to you, right? It's quite obvious. Until and unless we are fixing the age, right, it is very tough to know about the real picture of history, right? Because let us talk the case of Mahabharata, or let us take the case of Vedas. If we'll talk about the Mahabharata, so at least it took 1,000 years, right? And at least in those 1,000 years, we have seen 3 different kind of societies, right? If you are talking about the Mahabharata, in that case we can talk about started somewhere from later Vedic period. Isn't that true? Right. So, okay, it talks about the society of the later Vedic period, and that is basically agriculturist rural society. And then from here, and in fact, there were so many things which are talking about this. If we'll read Mahabharata, the ancient part of Mahabharata, so those practices which were basically there in use, these have been discussed in Mahabharata, such as Niyoga system. Right. What is this Niyoga system? Yes. Due to any reason, if the lady is not getting a child, right, In that case, the lady could make relationship with somebody else to get a child, right? That is known as Niyoga system. And this system was in practice during the later Vedic period. And in fact, do you remember any such instance in Mahabharata? No, not Kunti. What? The mother of Pandavas. Kunti, mother of Pandavas? No, sorry, you are saying wrong. The mother of basically Dhritarashtra, Vidur and Pandu, sorry, not Pandav. So basically these were not, I hope you remember that. Actually they took birth because of a, saint or because of a sadhu or monk, right, or sage. That's a different thing, right? That might be also, somehow this is because it has been shown in history on Mahabharata that there is a Muni, there is a sage which is coming and then they are taking birth, right? So, okay, fine. In history it has been shown in a different way, right? But somehow this is the reality and it was nothing but called as Niyoga system, right? So that was in practice during I'm just giving you one example, right? There were so many certain, such practices which could be seen in Mahabharata. So the society started from later Vedic period, then the urbanized phase, the second urbanization, and then finally the decline of the urbanization and again rural phase is coming, right? So so many phases of society have been gleaned or have been seen in Mahabharata, could be seen in Mahabharata, and that is why you can understand it is very tough which part is talking about which society, right? And definitely these are different parts, and somehow if you can make it, that okay, this particular, as you do know about 18 parvas of Mahabharata, so somehow if you can make this detail clear, or if you can make it clear that okay, these are the parvas which are talking about this phase, these are the parvas which are talking about this stage of life, and in that way it would be very simple for you to understand the society. But it is very tough to mark that okay, these parvas are reflecting that, or this part of the text is reflecting with society, right? So somehow it is the most complicated problem with the with the text, right? Sorry? Well, polygamy also could be seen here. That's a nice example. Yeah, because it could be seen in Mahabharata, and polygamy came into practice somewhere around in Mahajanpada period, right? So that's another example of showing the society, right? What next? Geography. Just give me a second. Second thing that I was discussing about the geographical location, right? So as you do know that while discussing Ramayana, I just told you that you first write and then we'll discuss. Most of the Indian text was not confined. Most of the Indian text was not confined to a particular geographical location. Geographical location, as the Vedas and the epics because these are always treated a sacred text in every part of India, at least by Hindu people. Although sometimes we do find the regional variations in such texts such as Ramayana, even though we cannot generalize about the societies in different parts of India. Now, I hope you are getting my point. Right, Ramayana is a sacred text, right? And definitely Ramayana is a sacred text even in South India. And why only in South India? If we'll talk about some other Southeast Asian countries, so Ramayana is supposed to be a sacred text even in those Southeast Asian countries as well, right? So now you just tell me one thing. Can we imagine about a society, or can we imagine about a society, or can we generalize about a society which has been gleaned in Ramayana? Because the South Indian society is altogether different from the North Indian society. The society that we do find in Southeast Asian countries, that is also different from the society that we find in North India or in India, right? So somehow, if any text has been developed, right, and that text originally has been developed, in North India, and if we're trying to find, or if we're trying to study about the South Indian society on the basis of these texts, that won't be feasible for us, right? But somehow this is again one of the problem, and because of what, it is very tough, right, to tell about or to know about the society on the basis of these kind of texts, right? Third, authorship. The authorship, right? Okay, look, that's actually the next problem with the text, right? So how come it is the next problem? Because if you are talking about any text, as you do know that it was not composed or compiled in any particular period, it means that there were so many authors which must be involved in that, right? And as numbers of authors were involved in that, and it is very necessary to understand that what was the mindset of those people. Suppose, let me give you one idea. Suppose Mahabharata has been compiled in different formats or in different ages. In that case, definitely different authors are coming and they are actually contributing in Mahabharata, and all the authors might have different biases while writing the writing Mahabharata. So somehow, if you don't understand the nature of authors, how can you conclude anything from the text about the society? So that is also becoming one of the problem, because of what? It is very tough to extract his history from such kind of text, right? You just write. It is very tough to fix. It is very tough to fix the authorship. The authorship of any text as it was composed by many authors in different ages. Without understanding the background of authors, the real sense of writing cannot be fixed. Real sense of writing cannot be fixed. So before studying any text, as a source of history, first we need to understand about the authorship. And which is not an easy task. Got the point? Sorry? No, we have numbers of Ramayanas. That day I think you missed it. I just told you that there were 300 different stories of Ramayana. Yeah, definitely. Regional languages are definitely making the difference. But apart from that, they'll find 300 different stories of Ramayana also. And it is varying partially, right? I'm not saying the story is completely different, but yes, some differences are there. Somewhere you'll find that Lakshman is the central character. Somewhere you'll find that Ravana is playing more important role as compared to the Ramayana that we do know. Carry on. Of course. Second, okay, fine. ठीक है. Look, normally you can say it for Ramayana, right? But even though, as I told you, that whenever you're talking about Ramayana, so just now I told you that whenever you are talking about Ramayana, so Ramayana is basically about the clash between the Aryans and the non-Aryans, right? But somehow, if you are talking about Ramayana or you are trying to perceive Ramayana in that way, do you find that such kind of classes ever took place in South India? The development of we can say the Aryanization of South India, happened through a different process, right? So the Aryanization definitely happened even in South India, but the process was different. The Aryanization happened in North India in a different way, and somehow we can say that yes, Ramayana is briefly or roughly, roughly telling us about the Aryanization of North India. But somehow we might find a different sort of a different version of Ramayana in South India. It doesn't mean that it is altogether different or it is talking about a different process. Right, we will find certain varieties or certain differences, but it does not mean that the basic story is changing. Right, somehow we can say the basic story remains same, and that is why we can say even though, that is why I just took the example of Ramayana, even though sometimes we find the regional variation even in the text, even though it doesn't reflect the real picture of the society, and it doesn't talk about the South Indian society, it doesn't talk about the Dravidian society, because as you do know, the Aryanization even took place in South India, but that Aryanization is basically about a process of coordination, right? Do you know about Aryanization of South India? Any idea? In North India, at least you do know that the Aryans are coming, right? And the Aryans are having clash with the local or indigenous people, right? And then finally they establish their dominance over Indian society. That's a common process. Everybody must be aware of this. But in South India, this is not happening. South India is all about gradual migration of the Aryans into that region. And then what happened? Definitely the Dravidians or the people, those who are living in South India, already had a sort of culture and society, right? And there you won't find that much dominance of Brahmanism, and it is coming, but it is coming gradually, right? So that is why in Sangam literature you will find that initially they were not much discussing about Brahmanism, but gradually that Brahmanism is becoming dominant. So it's a more process of coordination rather than class, right? Which is true for North Indian society, and that is the reason that it is not and that is what was said initially, that the whole South India was Aryanized by some of the people. And in fact, you must be knowing about Rishi Agastya, right? He is supposed to be the first fellow who actually crossed the Vindhya range, went South India, and just by reaching South India, he Aryanized the people, those who are living in this area. And when people started studying history of India, so that was the normal perception, the people started reaching to that area, and then only they got Aryanized, and that process ultimately civilized them. Right, so that was the normal perception. Over the time, when we have started using some other sources such as Sangam literature and all, and then we came to know that they already had an advanced culture. They already had then we started talking about the megalithic culture and the Sangam culture, and started talking about the Indo-Roman trade, and somehow we came to know about their advanced way of life. And then we can't say it was just because of the North Indian Aryans that they are reaching there and they are Aryanizing the people, and then they are entering into a civilization. That cannot be said. So this is not giving a picture of the Dravidian society. But even though Ramayana is supposed to be a sacred text even in South India, I hope you must be knowing about the person who is writing the Tamil version of Ramayana, right? Got my point or not? It is clear? Okay, fine.
So can we say that the Dravidians are shifting towards south? The Dravidians were the original inhabitants in the Pakistan and Kashmir region, and they are gradually shifted to south due to the Aryans invasion.
No, that we cannot say, because any as such theory is not talking about that. No theory is talking about that, right? Okay, so I think this point is clear. Okay, fine. Next. One-sided view. One-sided view of society. One-sided view of society. One-sided view of society. Look, what this point is all about. As you do know, whatever the literature that we do know in India, either irrespective of its nature, right? Religious or secular, whatever it is, right? Ultimately, one thing that is 100% true, that all the literatures were ultimately composed and compiled as well by the Brahmins, right? So don't you find that it was always reflecting, or it was always showing us the Brahminical version, right, of society, right? So the way they were perceiving about the society, that is what being reflected in the literature. So what was the attitude, or what was the sort of life of the common man? What was the life, or what was the attitude these people were having? What kind of responses these people were having? Somehow we are unable to know about that. Getting my point or not, right? So that's the biggest problem. That's also one of the biggest problem with the literature, with the the text. Write down. Most of the literature in ancient India, most of the literature in ancient India were composed and compiled by Brahmins. That is why these are not giving the real picture. That is why these are not giving the real picture of the society. These texts always try to justify these these texts always justified the exploitation of lower varnas, and we are always unable to know the responses by the lower varna and lower class people. Once subaltern school, acha, have you seen the videos? Have you got enrolled yourself? No? Because we have discussed all these things in a previous classes, right? So subaltern school is basically the school which talks about lower classes and the lower varna people, right? So far, suppose you are reading, let me discuss briefly and then I'll move ahead, right? So basically, as this is the case, I mean, suppose we are picking. So what is happening if the Brahmin people are writing? So they are only writing for the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins, right? They are writing about the systems which are prevalent in the society, right? But somehow, definitely, they hardly bother for the lower classes or the lower sections of the society and their responses, right? So now there is a school which actually talks about the history of these kind of people, right? Such as women, the lower varna people, the lower caste people. So now what was I telling you? Subaltern school came into existence it became problematic for them to write the history of the other sections of society. Although the literature such as although the literature such as Jatkas and Panchatantra, Jatkas and Panchatantra are giving some insight on this line. Got the point? Right? So, okay, if all the texts were developed and compiled, right, by the Brahmin people, so they have definitely discussed about those practices and the systems. Just by reading those practices and the systems, we can at least say one thing, okay, the lower class or the lower section of the society are being exploited by the upper sections of the societies, right? Now, once I say section, so there might be, the division into many subcategories, such as it may be in terms of economy, it may be in terms of caste, maybe in terms of varna. So there might be so many upper and lower sections, right? And that is why I am using the term section, right? So now, okay, fine, we understood about that. So normally in the Brahmanical literature you will find, let me give you one example, such as suppose if a Brahmin fellow is committing a sin, right? If a Brahmin fellow is committing a sin, in that case definitely the punishment was basically very, sort of minimal for him, right? But if you'll see the vice versa, see the same case vice versa, in that case you'll find if any Dalitis or any person from the lower caste is committing a sin, then definitely the punishment was very harsh, right? So somehow the Brahmins try to justify it in their text. The Brahmin people are always having some privileges. These are the people, who are the highly privileged people, and in fact, they are directly related to God, and that is why you can't punish the Brahmins. So they have just written in this way. So fine, you just came to know one thing, okay, this system was exploited. Okay, fine, that you can write. But what kind of responses the lower class or the lower section had, that you cannot write, right? How can you know about that? Because nobody is talking about that. So when you talk about, when we find about this, when we, started using this Jatkas for writing the history or the Panchtantras, then we find certain, sort of such instances, like, the same case if I'll take that, if the Brahmins were exploiting the lower Varna people, so what kind of responses they had towards this. So you'll find certain stories regarding this also, right? So somehow it is, on the basis of these kind of, texts, now definitely the subaltern historians are trying to create the history of the lower sections. But okay, if you are comparing these two with the huge Brahmanical literature, in that case, as you can understand, it is very tough, to find all the relevant sources, and that is why it is a problematic area, right? Next. Yeah. Valmiki was not Sudra. Valmiki was basically a thief, chor. Well, that I don't know. I don't. Maybe I'll just confirm it, because I don't remember it right now. Maybe, possible. Right? So what is the next problem? So I hope you got this point, one-sided view. So definitely it is presenting a single-sided view of the society. Right? Next. Language. Look, if we talk about language, that is also creating a problem. I am just again giving you a very simple example. The Sanskrit which was used in Veda, that Sanskrit is different from the Sanskrit used by Kalidas, or the Sanskrit what we are using in the present days, right? And sometimes you'll find the same word has changed its meaning in the later phase, right? And in that case, it is very tough to define or get the real sense of the sentence, right? Apart from that, as you do know, there was no as such grammar which was regulating Sanskrit in the earlier phase, right? And if any language which is not controlled by a grammar, which is not regulated by a grammar, so it is very hard to get the real sense of the text, right? And somehow these are some of the complications that we normally face with the Brahmanical literature, right? And because and apart from this, definitely language is such a thing that the first thing that we do know about Sanskrit, which is coming from some the Central Asian side, right? That Sanskrit is coming to India and changing its shape and version, right? And then again it is intermixing with some local local languages, and then the influence of the local languages could be seen here, right? Like the interaction of Sanskrit with the tribal languages, the interaction, in fact there were so many words that have been picked up by Sanskrit from the local tribal languages, right? We'll find such kind of relationship between Sanskrit and Tamil. So these kind of interactions were very frequently going on, and now it is very tough to decide from what particular age or from what particular moment these kind of interactions or so these kind of interchanges started, and that is why, as we are not pretty sure about the language and somehow it is making the task or more typical, right? That's also one of the problem, right? So just write down in few sentences. In India, the languages and its development is a complex issue. As languages kept on interchanging or intermixing with each other, comma, the nature of the languages also got changed, such as Sanskrit, comma, which creates problem in understanding for the text. Next, absence of materialism. We do find the materialistic life of society in such text, but unfortunately materialism was never the prime concern. Of these writings. Most of the writings got developed around the spiritual life or the religious philosophies. Which makes the task tough for historian to know the material life of the society which is considered to be most important subject in history. Got the point? Right? Clear? Okay.
At this point, we are talking about materialism. In what sense? In economical sense?
No, not economic sense, right? Look, anything which is, which could be part of materialism, right? Suppose if you're using this in a mobile phone, that is also materialism. So use of mobile phone doesn't talk about economy, right? So if you're using any pottery, right? If you're using any kind of cloth, right? So that is, these all kind of things could be, part of materialism. So in normal description of the life, right? What kind of, life ways we people are having, right? What kind of relationship we people are having, like the relationship between these two, the relationship between two people is also part of materialism. So when I say materialism, it doesn't mean anything which is apart from spiritualism, that is materialism, right? So somehow that was definitely not the prime concern. Okay, fine, accepted ki they were slightly discussing about the materialistic things, right? While describing some other things, that was somehow becoming part of the description, but it does not mean ki materialism was there of their prime concern, right? And that is why they were not focused in that, right? And once they are not focused in that, so definitely we just find the passing reference, right? Yes? Something happened. We just find the passing reference, right? And that's the reason, because of what? And of course, for history, it is the materialism which is the most important thing rather than the spiritualism. That might be one, section of history, that might be one subject in history, but definitely not the most important subject, and that is what has been emphasized in those writings, right? Okay. Next. Theoretical or imaginary. Theoretical or imaginary. Look, if we'll talk about the sacred religious texts, mostly these were theoretical, right? And if we'll talk about the literary, sort of thing, basically the novels and some other writing, so these are basically imaginary. So no one was talking about the real world, right? So one is more focused on the religious theories and one is more focused on the imaginary sort of thing. And that is why it is very tough to extract history, right? Just write 1 or 2 lines. The religious texts were mostly theoretical. By theoretical, what exactly I mean, right? You can find numbers of literature developed around philosophies, Sankhya philosophy or any other philosophies. So of course these books are theoretical, or these texts are theoretical. They had nothing to do with this material world, right? And they are mostly dealing with the theory. And whenever you talk about the theoretical part of anything, so the practical parts are completely missing in those kind of writing. Getting my point, right? Because you are dealing with the theories of salvation, God, Brahm, and these kind of things, but somehow the materialistic things are not there, right? So mostly, what you have written? Theoretical, which dealt with religious theories, Unfortunately, we don't find any as such text of the materialistic philosophers, such as Charvak. I hope you all know Charvak. Sorry? Related to? No. That he was Charak. Look, you must be knowing about so many religious philosophers, right? Like you must be knowing about Patanjali, you must be knowing about Kapil Muni, and so many sages were there. Those who were talking about the religious philosophies. And the philosophies such as Sankhya philosophy, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisesik, Mimamsa, Vedic philosophy, right? So many philosophies were there. And as you do understand, these philosophies were basically, talking about the religious philosophies, right? And there was few philosophers which talked about the materialistic philosophy, such as Charvak. Charvak very simply said, look, there's nothing, is there in religion and these kind of philosophies. You are just wasting your time in worshipping and rituals and some other thing. The only thing that you must do, right, just try to give more and more pleasure to yourself, right? And when he is talking about pleasure, so it was not the spiritual pleasure, it was materialistic pleasure. वो बोलते हैं कि ज्यादा सुख दो अपने आप को, ठीक है? क्या अच्छा लगता है बॉडी को? आप सभी जानते हैं बॉडी को क्या अच्छा लगता है. अच्छा खाना अच्छा लगता है, ठीक है? सेंसेस आपको पता है, आईज है, स्किन है, टंग है, ठीक है? सो एज पर द सेंसेस ही इज जस्ट सिंपली सेइंग यू टू गिव मोर एंड मोर प्लेजर, राइट? वो बोलते हैं इफ यू डोंट हैव मनी टू बाय द गुड थिंग्स फॉर यू, राइट, टेक द लोन बट बाय इट, right? So he was a hardcore materialistic philosophy, and mind you, his philosophy is known as Lokayat philosophy, most popular philosophy. So even in that particular phase, people got attracted towards this philosophy, right? And they started following it. But unfortunately, we don't have any book, right? Somehow, if we would have come to know about his book, so at least it would have been giving some insight on, the thinking and the thoughts which were materialistic. We don't know about that, right? Right? Continue it. Whether the secular literatures were mostly imaginary. That is why the historians have to be very cautious. Historians have to be very cautious while extracting history from these sort of literatures. Right? Now, somehow we now come to know about the negative aspects of the literary sources. Now, definitely there are not much positive sides of this. But even though, if any question that you are writing on literary sources, and mind you, whenever you will be asked any questions on literary sources, you must be asked the negative sides of the literary sources, or you must be asked for the critical analysis of the literary sources. But we need to discuss definitely the positive sides as well. So whenever you talk about the positive sides, right, so what are the things that could be discussed? The positive sides, right? So definitely there might be so many positive sides. So ultimately anything that you are reading, anything, irrespective of its nature, right, it's talking about society only. Isn't that correct? Right? Because they are definitely talking about society, because ultimately they are writing something about society. It may be that the objective is spiritual, objective is religious, but writing about society. So while doing this process, definitely they are giving numerous details of the society. Right? So I hope you'll manage this point. So they are writing a lot about the society. Right? Second, there were so many texts which were developed around the historical figures. Right? Again, you do have lots of examples, right? So anything like, any as such novel, if Arthashastra has been written, right, and apart from Arthashastra and like Niti Sar is there, or Mudra Rakshas is there, Devi Chandraguptam is there, right? So all these books have been ultimately developed around a historical figure. So yes, definitely it is helping us while recreating the history, right? So that's the another thing which is helping. Third, what might be other positive things? कुछ बताइए आप लोग भी. Sorry? Era. Oh, that is one of the confusions actually. So we can't, this is slightly vague. Okay, third is important thing, that the secular text is giving numerous detail of society. Basically the materialistic part, what I'm trying to tell you. So yes, basically there were so many secular texts also, right? Like, you cannot avoid the books like Indica, you cannot avoid the books like Arthashastra, Kam Sutra, Natya Shastra, right? Silpa Shastra. So there were so many other texts, and you can't ignore these texts because somehow these are actually dealing with the materialistic, stuff. So yes, we do get some valuable information from these kind of texts. So yes, this also must be included here, right? So these are some positive sides that you can mention, right? Now, if any as such question is there, try to now listen me carefully, right? Suppose if any as such question is coming on literary sources, which is asking for the negative aspects of the, or critical analysis of the literary sources, so definitely you'll begin with the negative aspects, right? But while ending your answer, if it is specifically asking about the negative sides of the literary sources, right? So you'll definitely prefer mentioning the negative sides. But while ending the answer, this will be your conclusion, right? Of course, the conclusion won't be shorter. The conclusion would be slightly bigger, right? But in that conclusion, we'll just discuss about the positive sides as well. I'm just coming to this point, right? So somehow it is only about literary sources. So this is the way in which you are going to write the answer. If it is about sources, right, or it is broadly, it is not asking you the positive or negative sides of literary sources, right? It is simply asking about the literary sources. In that case, what is going to happen after writing all these positive and negatives of the literary sources? You need to write about the archaeological sources, right? So you'll end up the answer just by mentioning the archaeological sources, that literary sources can't be complete in its own, right? Until and unless we try to correlate the literary sources with the archaeological sources, the real picture won't come out. Getting my point or not? Right? So you just try to learn these kind of, because ultimately the application of these things could get you better marks, right? So somehow whenever you are writing this, or if it is vice versa, if you are writing about archaeological sources, so at the end you need to write that ultimately, until and unless you are trying to correlate the archaeological sources with the literary sources, the real picture doesn't come out. In India already there is a dearth of archaeological sources. Mostly you are relying on the literary sources, and that is why coordination is very much required and important, right? So I hope you got the point. So most of the things we have discussed in the literature, in for the sources, and as any such question is coming, just you have to make the balance, right? That will learn further also while writing the answers, right? But that you remember. Now we are just left with two things, right? These are the foreign sources, right? And second, I just told you that from some of the sources direct questions are being asked, such as Purana and some Charitas, biographies, right? So that we'll discuss in tomorrow's class, the biographies. Basically I'll discuss the Harsh Charita and Purana, right? So after covering this, I'll move to the next section or the next topic, that is prehistory, a Stone Age. So maybe after that, tomorrow we'll start this next chapter or next topic. Oh, sorry, Monday, right? So yes, you guys come after reading NCERT, at least the Stone Age, right? So maybe Stone Age won't take much time because the chances of the questions are very less, right? So we'll just try to roughly understand what Stone Age is. The first thing, what kind of some basic details, and then we'll basically focus on those areas from where the possibility of questions are there. Because if you are talking about Neolithic, so there are few areas from where the questions could be framed, right? So we'll just try to catch those areas. Thank you.